Welcome to the 256th episode of the Jami Dulaney Plant-Based Wellness Podcast. My name is Jami Dulaney, and I'm your host, and I'm also a mom. As of 11:32 last evening, March 28th, Caleb James came into the world. 7 pounds, 13 ounces, 20 inches long, perfectly pink, big hands, big feet, gonna be a basketball player. Couldn't be more happy. Addie and Nathan are doing well, a little frustrated, and I'm going to go into that and rant and rave, but the main thing is that they're healthy, and I'm a mom. So as I promised, it took me 3 weeks to deliver on it. I guess it took Addie 9 months to deliver on it, but we're there. So all is well, and thank everybody for their support that have sent me encouraging emails and Facebook posts. It's been great. So, you know, nothing happens in the world of Dulaney's without a little bit of a story, and I'm going to tell you a COVID-related birth story. I hope everybody's well. I hope people haven't got COVID. Again, it's a scary illness that we can't see, and it's caused a lot of implementation of plans, some with thoughts, some without thoughts, some with merit, some without merit, some for the wrong reasons. And I'm going to start with COVID testing. So as a pre-admission for a potential induction labor, Houston Women's Hospital required that women get a COVID testing, not their spouse that can be in the room. And by the way, they can only have one person in the room. And when you came in, you can't go out. So they had to carry everything that they needed in. But anyway, 3 days before induction, a COVID test was performed, a nasopharyngeal swab. Pregnant people have an increased risk of bleeding. So do elderly, so do people that are on blood thinner. Addie came home, no complications at the time of the swab. At about 12 hours later, bent over and had a horrendous nosebleed, a posterior nosebleed, meaning that it was in the posterior sinus area where you can't put pressure on. And that's the biggest risk of bleeding to any complication. That's why people get colonoscopies, they're taken off a blood thinner. That's why you don't want to stick things where you can't get a hold and put pressure. You know, in medical school, we say all bleeding stops, but it doesn't stop very quickly in some instances, especially if you can't put pressure on it. So if I have an open wound that I can put pressure on, I'm not worried about stopping the bleeding. But the other night, when Addie was bleeding from her posterior nose out both nasal passages and down her throat, if she had not been calm, had she not been elderly, if she had been elderly, had she been a child, her airway could have been easily compromised, and it could have resulted in death. It took us over 2 hours to stop the bleeding. Again, it was severe, and had she gone into labor during that, it would have been a huge issue. Fast forward, she goes in for her induction. The nosebleed occurs again. So there was a potential. She did not have to have an emergency C-section. She delivered fine, long and exhausting labor, but she's fine. They got the nosebleed under control again. But you have to look at, why do we do these tests? It wasn't done on Nathan, the father, so he went into the room. They weren't going to exclude him or her from being in the hospital. The test, whether it was positive or negative, had nothing to do with her. You could say, well, it may have affected the treatment of a baby, but the baby would have already had the RNA had she had it, or the antibiotics, so there was nothing they would be able to do differently. And by the way, there wasn't a pediatrician in the hospital to see the baby anyway, so what does it matter? Because they weren't going to do anything differently anyway. They were going to react to whatever happened, just like you react to anything that happens during a delivery. So unless somebody has a pre-test probability of a disease or a positive test, to do any kind of a test is going to result in a lot of false positives and a decreased accuracy of the test. So if we do a stress test or a COVID test or a CAT scan just to look, and we don't have a high probability of finding something before some sort of symptom or some sort of reason for the test, the chance of getting accurate information is less, much less. The chance for risk or hurting the patient is much greater. There's not a benefit. So in her case, obviously, it was for humanity. It was for the hospital staff to know whether or not Addie was positive for COVID. It had nothing to do with Addie. They wore masks in the hospital room at all time. Again, she had no fevers, no chills. She had been quarantined. Very, very low likelihood. So this way outweighed the benefits of this test for her, anybody, or society. And, I think I would like to put out there, if anybody is contemplating just to get this test, if you have the sniffles or the cold, it's not the test to have. Stay home, deal with your infection. We don't need to test the world over and over again. And if the test is negative on Sunday, it could have become positive, or she could have been exposed, on the next subsequent day. She's supposed to have isolated herself. Wonder if she didn't isolate herself. You're relying on the person to do that. So, it just made absolutely no sense. Then the saga, continues as far as induction and protocols to come in the middle of the night, to start out exhausted. The lack of hospital staff, because obviously with COVID, the hospital staff is decreased. Now after a holiday, you have more moms starting to be induced, and natural spontaneous labors, and now you have a hospital that's overwhelmed. And this results in poor care, poor supplies, isolation, lack of compassion. The list goes on and on and on. And it's not just here, it's everywhere. We have protocoled and ruled and paper pushed our way into a system of very poor medical care with no compassion. It's not about the patient anymore. It's about, did you document? It's about, did you follow protocol? Did you check all the boxes? Is it timely? Will the hospital make money? Did you turn over enough beds? Do you fill enough beds? I could go on and on, but it gives. We need to turn back the clock. We need to turn back to the clock to compassionate medicine for a reason. I was taught never to do a test on someone unless I knew what I was going to do with the answer. I was taught not to do any harm. I was taught that the patient is first, and you treat the patient like your family to be treated. And I have to say that I am so fortunate for the practice that I'm in right now. My practice, I used to call people my patients. Now I call them members of the practice, because and they expressed to me during our Zoom nutrition class last night that there was a bunch of uncles and aunts waiting the arrival of their new niece, of their new nephew with Addie, because Addie's our registered dietitian. That doesn't come in big box medicine. Compassion and caring and a sense of community can never happen in a big box situation like that. And I'm so grateful and thankful for all the members of my practice, and that we can be a family and share in good times and support each other in times that are tough, and make decisions together. It's not about rules and regulation, but how do we take care of each other the best possible way? And we need to go back to that. I was interviewed this week by a magazine about my medical practice, because residents coming out of training, what do? Residents, you go through medical school, and then you go through a residency program in the field that you're choosing, whether it's internal medicine, family medicine, surgery. And then you come, but you have no idea what you do when you finish. Working as a resident is nothing like being out in the real world as a physician. It's not anything like being an academic physician. The closest thing that comes to it's why people become hospitalists now, because you're just a resident that gets paid a little bit more. There's no continuity of care. You have no relationships with patients. You don't know who they are when they come in. They're a mere number. And when we reduce people down to numbers and not patients and not personalities and not people with families, there's no way you care for them. There's been studies after studies shown that if you take somebody's identity away, people are not treated near as well as if they have an identity. If they have this is Charlie and his wife lives, has this, and they came from here and they have 2 kids. If you don't know that about people, you can't treat them with the respect and kindness and compassion that they deserve. And so anyway, I was interviewed by this magazine as far as our practice and what we do, because I've been through all the practices. I started out in academic medicine. I was in a large group practice. I was in a small group practice. And then I went out on my own, and then I became a concierge wellness practice 3 years ago. And so I've been through the gamut of practice, and I wouldn't change things a bit. Yes, I've evolved. It would be hard to go into this practice right out of medical school without some sort of mentorship or some sort of person that could guide you. But in the case of obstetrics, wouldn't it be a wonderful world? What a wonderful world it would be if obstetricians just took enough patients so they could actually deliver their own babies and be there for their own families, and be compassionate, as opposed to have 20 doctors. So they take call one night a week for in a month, and they have hospitalists that back them up that don't know the patient, and the patient doesn't know who's going to deliver. And everybody's a number again. There goes the compassion. And it's not good for the physician. When I was in a large group practice, it was like putting out fires all day. You would be in the hospital and running up and down the halls with 28 or 30 people to see. And, in a cardiology setting, it's usually, acute procedure to do, people having heart attacks. So it would be a day of, you would be in the hospital for a day, or you'd be in the office and get through as many people as you possibly can, spending as much time as you can, but certainly not educating them on plant-based nutrition, or how to get off of their medications, or how to titrate off their medications, or what if, people are just, the boxes are checked, the electronic medical records are cut and pasted, handouts are given, and people are sent on their way. It's not compassionate. And if you think I'm ranting and raving right now, I am ranting and raving, because I am so sorry that a profession I love has got to the point where we're not treating people with the kindness that they deserve, and the compassion that they deserve, and the medical thought process that they deserve. Cookie cutter medicine, again, it's back to the COVID style medicine. We're treating for the masses. Screw the individual. Screw the person that's going to be in labor by herself, or screw the elderly person in the nursing home that's not getting a visit from anybody. No touch, no feel, no compassion. That's not what it's all about. And we need to take it back. We need to take that back as a society and stand up and say, this is how we're going to practice medicine. As physicians, we kowtow to the pharmaceutical industry. We kowtow to hospital administrations, and again, rules and regulations, and again, insurance companies to try to make a living. And people come out of school in debt. It's very difficult. This is not the profession to be in if you want to make a lot of money and have a nice lifestyle. It's not what it's about. Most people know that. They want to help people because, as everybody out there knows, you get the best satisfaction in your life when you're actually giving to other people and helping other people. That's when you feel good. And doctors want to do that too, but they get caught up in that system that, how am I going to make ends meet if we don't do this? There is another way. I hope that when this article comes out, I'm going to share it on my website. I hope that residents will think about going into a practice where they can, make a reasonable living, but also have a good quality of life and be able to provide care for their patients like they would ultimately want to be cared for. So that's my rant for the day. I think that we really just have to think about it. And if you are a patient consumer, and I think that's, or a member of a practice, you deserve to have answers. You deserve to have a physician call you. If your appointment is scheduled or they're delayed, you should not have to wait in a waiting room for hours on end. You should be able to speak with a physician anytime you want to. You should have every question answered that you have. There is no stupid question. There is no question that is too You know, you should be able to get any question you have answered. That's just all there is to it. A dialogue. I don't know is an acceptable answer from a physician, so you need to be able to accept that and work with a physician. How do we find out? How can we work together to try to best find that out? That's what needs to happen. So maybe we should do a little plant-based nutrition now. Well, while I've been waiting here in isolation, I've been making bread. You say, bread? Dr. Dulaney, are we supposed to eat bread? Doesn't that cause us all to be overweight and get diabetes? It's a starch. Sourdough bread. And we'll talk a little bit about sourdough bread, but specifically I'm talking about my grandmother's salt raisin bread. And I've talked about it before. It's our cookbook, Plant-Based Wellness Cookbook. The first page is dedicated to my grandma Addie, who made salt raisin bread, and she actually made it for the community. They'd buy it for 50 cents a loaf back in the 60s. And the reason why people came to buy it is it was delicious, but it's difficult and took a lot of steps. And, part of, you can go out and buy bakery bread. Typically most bakery breads have oil, they have emulsifiers, they have shelf stabilizers, they have eggs in them. Real bread is yeast or some sort of fermented starter and water and a little bit of sugar to feed the bacteria and yeast, whether you get it from yeast, cake yeast, or you get it from the yeast in the air. So anyway, I was baking bread, and the salt raisin bread, actually, you use the fermentation of potato water. So you take potatoes and cornmeal and a little bit of sugar, and you ferment that with water, and you use this broth to add to flour. And the yeast in the flour and the bacteria in the flour take this fermentation another step, and it doubles in size, and then you add more flour, and it rises, and you make bread, salt raisin bread. I don't know where the salt comes from. There is a little salt in it, but salt helps bread to rise and become stabilized, but teaspoon, 5 loaves, not, it's not like it's a salty bread by any stretchination. It should be more of a potato bread. It's a coarse, dense bread. But anyway, I've been making it while I've been waiting here for Caleb James to be born. And I started reading about bread, and I started thinking about, this bread that we make has soy milk in it instead of regular milk. It doesn't have any oil. And so the nutritional value of it has a fair amount of protein. It has some fiber in it, and again, it's fermented, so it's good for your gut microbes. What we do know is, and we'll take those microbes a little bit further and apply them to our current COVID situation after this, but when you look at sourdough bread, you start with a starter that's flour and water, and you feed it, and you get bacteria from the flour, and turns out bacteria from the hands. There was a study done that looked at making sourdough bread, and they went to 14 commercial bakers, and they gave them all the same flour, and they had them make a starter, and then they brought that starter to a facility, and they made bread, and they did swabs of the baker's hands. They did DNA testing of the bacteria in their hands, and they did DNA testing of the bacteria and yeast in the flour, and they looked to see what bacteria and yeast they found, and they also looked to see where it came from. And surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, from most of the yeast to do sourdough bread and the bacteria come from the actual flour itself. So if you're baking bread, an organic flour is really important, and an unbleached flour is also is important to use. Bread flours have more gluten. I'll speak a little bit of that in later, but gluten is what makes the bread hold together and makes it fluffy, and is of course the protein, one of the bigger protein components of bread. And so what they found was about 65 to 67% of the lactobacillus and yeast came from the flour, and 27% came from the baker's hands. Now, it couldn't be sure whether or not the baker's hands had been contaminated from the flour being a baker, but even washing the hands, they were still able to culture DNA from them that correlated with what they found in the bread and the starter. So I thought it was very interesting that baker's hands, we talk about hand washing and, but we need this lactobacillus, which is a very good bacteria to have because it's good for our gut microbes. So if you look at the gut, there is a single cell lining in the gut that keeps the individual cells, we call them columnar cells or column cells, or like little building blocks, and they have to be tight. And if they're not tight, then proteins seep in and get absorbed without being broken down, and inflammatory compounds can be absorbed. So we have this layer, this single cell layer, and lactobacillus makes a lot of that mucus that protects us. And so when people's microbiome is upset, interrupted, then dysbiosis starts to occur, and people start to have GI problems. So just a side kick as far as the gluten, very few people are actually gluten intolerant and have celiac. Those people can't tolerate gluten. But a lot of people have GI disturbances with wheat, and it may come from a variety of things. It could come from a wheat allergy itself. It could come from contaminants in the wheat. Again, if you're buying bread, if you're buying store-bought things that have all kinds of additives, if the wheat was genetically modified or treated with glyphosate, then those could all play a role in the intolerance, and gluten is ultimately blamed. I was in Sprouts the other day, and people were looking at snack food, and it's like, well, it's gluten-free, and so people think that gluten-free means that it's going to be healthy, and that couldn't be further from the truth. So gluten provides the protein. Most of the time, there are observational studies that people that eat wheat and gluten tend to have less heart disease. So it's by far not a risk factor for cancer. It's not a risk factor for heart disease. It doesn't cause everybody to have GI disturbance. So there you have it. So you make this starter, and you get a fermented bread out of it. And so should we ultimately be eating bread? And it's a difficult situation. If you're making bread, it's a time consuming. You go get the bread in the store, you're walking around. The kneading process actually is a pretty physical process when you're making bread. You can bypass that with a bread maker. That's cheating. You can bypass the mixing with a mixer. That, again, is making it more of a commercial process and less of a physical process. So I'm saying that if you want to indulge in eating bread, then you should make your own bread, and you should consider sourdough bread because of all these good microbes that you're actually helping to establish in your system. You're walking, you're kneading, you're lifting, you're bending over to check the bread. I ferment mine in the garage, so I walk to the garage, walk back, so there's a lot of extra steps on bread day. You're, again, carrying 5-10 pounds of flour when you buy it. So there's some activity associated with it. And plus you get something that you made and that you can savor. You're not just going to grab a piece and ram it down your mouth without thinking about it like you would walking by a bag of chips. So there've got to be rules about, how you go about your bread. Certainly if you take bread and you dunk it in a bunch of oil, or you fry it, or you put, a bunch of avocado smashed on it, guacamole, or nut butters, then you're increasing the oil content, you're increasing the calorie content. But perhaps, you make rules about the bread. Maybe you'd like to have some toast and jam, sourdough toast and jam for breakfast. Maybe you would like to have a piece of bread with your lunch, maybe, or your soup. It can have a place, but I think you have to have rules about when and how much and what you do to it to make it unhealthy. In the total calories that you need to take in the day for your energy expenditure and your size, we also need to get your nutrients in. So you need to get those greens in. The biggest thing you can do for yourself is to get those 4 to 5 cups of greens in. Not only does that nitric oxide that's produced through the amylase and the microbes in your mouth dilate your blood vessels, but it also helps your immune system. So we know that natural killer cells, or white blood cells that fight viruses, think COVID, is improved by the production of nitric oxide. So natural killer cells are turned on and the increased production by nitric oxide production. Nitric oxide is produced in the nose when you breathe through your nose, if you don't have a nosebleed. And that dilates the nasal passages and also turns on antimicrobial, antiviral particles in the nose. There's a bunch of filaments there. You stabilize the nasal environment just like you stabilize the GI environment. So that those greens are really important in your nutrition, both from a cardiovascular point and an inflammatory aspect. So we need to get those in. We need to get the fruit in. We need to get the vitamin C. Your protein it comes in naturally when you're eating the fiber from beans or the fiber from grains. All your other electrolyte minerals are going to come in there. So bread can play a great role. You know, societies have lived for years and years and years and years and years eating a homemade bread. It wasn't until we bastardized it and put stabilizers in it that will last for months on end, and other chemicals that are harmful to us, and genetically modified organisms that have resulted from Roundup that have caused us issues. So I think that, you know, it's a reasonable thing to incorporate in your diet or consider not being bad. You know, a lot of times diabetics crave bread, or people say they crave bread or they crave a sandwich. You just have to be mindful about what you're putting. If you're doing a vegetable sandwich, you know, with mustard, that could be good, but are you getting enough greens in throughout the day? So maybe you're going to have to steam your greens to get those in. Are you going to, you know, maybe breakfast is going to have to be all fruit if you're going to have some breakfast, you know, with a few chia seeds for your omega-3 if you're going to put the bread in. So be mindful about eating, strategic about how you're planning your menu for the day. And it can be very good if you're going out, you know, and if you're going out golfing and you just have a small salad for lunch and then you become hungry later on, that bread would have served a really good purpose, especially, again, the sourdough bread that tends to be a little bit heavier, and it's going to take up some space and give you some nutrients and calcium and B vitamins and manganese. So I think that there very much is a role to be able to do that. If you finally look at the nutrition of profile of sourdough breads, about 162 calories per slice. There's 32 grams of carbohydrate, and 2 to 4 grams of fiber, and 6 grams of protein. There's selenium, 22% of the RDA. There's 20% of the RDA for folate, thiamine, manganese, niacin, 14%, and 12% of your daily requirements for iron. So there's a lot of good things in bread. It just happens to be calorie dense, so it's not something that you eat mindless. And people say that they can't control what they eat, but if you compare going over, if you go to Outback and you get that brown loaf that they serve, or you go to Carrabba's, I'm just thinking of places that I've been in the past where they bring you a loaf of bread, and it's that real soft bread, and you're hungry and you're talking and you're having a good time, and people just eat it till it's gone, and they eat it really quickly, and there's usually a hunk of butter there, so people will mindlessly put that hunk of butter on there. That's the wrong environment to have your bread. That's really the wrong environment. Again, you want to save it for when it's really good bread. So I think you put yes and no's on things. If something has eggs in it and you're plant-based, you don't eat it. If something has oil in it and you've decided to give up oil, and you know that bread that's going to be on the table is going to be full of oil, probably eggs, egg wash, perhaps whey protein, which is a milk protein, can't eat it. It's not plant-based. It's a yes and no, black and white rule, as opposed to maybe once in a while, maybe yes, maybe no. So I think that, that makes it a little bit easier. How do we prepare to live going future? People talk about going back to normal. Some states are opening up partly, some aren't opening up. People are trying to figure out how to play sports, how to go to church, how to go to the mall, how to get a haircut, how to shake somebody's hand, how to hug somebody. People are desperate for social interaction. We know people that live to be 100 did so by being socially engaging and having a sense of purpose. And I'm going to go back to having a sense of compassion for their fellow humans. One of the things that Addie said last night to me was, it's hard to see, people are nice to me here, but it's hard to see facial expression when people have a mask on. You know, is it worth being exposed to actually have be able to see somebody and have facial expression? You know, that's up to you. There was a person that posted the microbes on a petri dish with and without a face mask, and it's like, just because there's microbes doesn't mean that they're bad. There's bacteria and virus and yeast have been around well before humans. They're going to be probably around long after humans, and they're in the oceans, they're in the air, and there are a lot of good ones. And we learned this, you know, and unfortunately history is having to repeat itself, but we learned this a long time ago. We went through the plagues and people dying of diseases because of bad water, and we learned to sanitize, but we overdid it. We sanitized everything. We gave antibiotics for everything because drug companies told us that you know, there's no reason to suffer. Give people antibiotics, don't not treat. And so we were overzealous with antibiotics. Our antibiotic use in humans has not increased, but it's increased in the animals, you know, because they're living in feedlots. They're living in these big buildings all together, and there's all kinds of diseases being sprouted because of poor living conditions. Think back to poor living conditions when cities were crowded and the water wasn't clean. These animals are subjected to that. Different bacteria and different viruses are selected. When we kill one bacteria or virus, we're selecting for perhaps a more virulent bacteria or virus. But the other thing that we're doing is we're decreasing our microbiome within ourselves, and what we will call a homeostasis, or that perfect community of just the right bacteria and the viruses that, you know, and fungi and that are around us and in us, in the diversity. We know that people that eat 40 different vegetables a week have the most diverse microbiome in their colon. And we know that if we have if farmers have a diverse variety of seeds, they have the best chance of growing the best crop. But when we start to alter that, either through Roundup and actually decreasing the amino acid production in our plants, or selecting for more virulent bacteria or viruses in the air from feedlots, and then feeding humans a deficient diet so our immune system is poorly functioning, being overweight and having an inflammatory state throughout our body, it sets us up for bad interactions with our environment. I heard a quote by Zeb Bush, or he was asked what would do, and I totally agree with him. You know, the best thing that you can do for yourself is get outside and get in as many different environments as you can. You know, it's why they ultimately have parks in cities, so you can get around some green. When you're in the inner city and it's all cement, all car, you know, gases coming from, you know, exhaust, that's not what you want to breathe in. In a gym with stale air and musty air, that's not the only thing, you know, that's not a preferential thing to breathe in hospital with bacteria that's been selected by antibiotics. It's not a good environment. The environment we need is outside and with other humans. Human interaction allows the mixing of good bacteria, not gut bacteria, but good bacteria between humans. Even people that have a dog, their children are more healthy and have less allergies because they have a more diverse microbiome. You know, I know back in the day, you know, my mother's like, oh, don't touch the dog, wash your hands, don't touch the dog. You know, the dog is dirty, the dog, you know, and on the other hand, people say, oh, you know, take a bath, get your kids, you know, don't get dirty and all this other kind of stuff. But really, you know, a little bit of dirt goes a long way. A little bit of sharing of microbiomes go a long way into making us resilient and safe and having a good environment within us. There was a study looking at coral reefs, and and when they in areas where there had been overfishing, the microbiome there had been disturbed such that the coral was depleted because there wasn't this layer of protection. In areas where there wasn't fishing, they had a much more pristine coral because they had a better microbiome environment there. So it's everywhere. It's not just humans. It's everywhere you look that we need to get our community set. So from a psychological community, interacting with people, being compassionate towards people, treating people like we would want to be seen, but also sharing microbiome, not being afraid of the bacteria and the viruses that are healthy out there. We need in making our own nutrition such that we're eating organic, we're eating high fiber, we're eating our greens, we're eating our fermented breads that help make us healthy as a host, is ultimately what's going to make us healthy as a population, not over-treating with medications or vaccines that are treating, just like somewhat of a video game. When something comes at us, we shoot it down, and then we start shooting without really aiming. We're just shooting everywhere in hopes that we get all the things we can't see, and that's not the way that we should really be living, I don't think. So that's my story. I'm sticking with it this week. I have been running. I've been running here in Houston with Addie's dog Haas. I'm, getting my mileage up. Feeling good. Still having a little bit of kicks here and there, especially if I've been sitting more than I should. I'm doing my bird dogs. I'm doing opposites. I'm doing the suitcase carry. All really, really good. And body maintenance and mind maintenance, to get outside every day and get some good Houston fresh air. We're going to be doing the Treasure Coast Marathon March 1st. If you want to come to Florida and join us, we're going to be pacing people. If you'd like to meet us and run with us, we're going to have several members there, as well as some of our staff, to run with people and have a good time. So think about that. If you've wanted to, it's going to be a nice small marathon to run together. If you'd like to come down and join us, check out our website, drdulaney.com, DOCTORDULANEY. See what our practice is about. We take care of people all over the place. You don't have to be in Florida. We have online memberships available. Of course, with COVID, we've all got good with telehealth as much as possible. But we'd love to see you in Port Charlotte and talk to you, answer any of your questions. You can visit us, Jami, at drdulaney.com. I believe in changing the practice of medicine to make it for the patient, not for a big box or for some big corporation. And that's what we're all about. And we're going to spread that word as much as possible and take back medicine and treat people like we want our family to be treated, and spread that word and help other people perhaps get a practice started that way, because there's a lot of unhappiness, a lot of unhappy doctors out there as well that are just beating the ground and not making any progress and prescribing the same medications over and over again, and people aren't getting better. There's a better way through plant-based nutrition. And we're seeing people get better every day from diseases that people didn't think they could get better from. And certainly the lifestyle diseases, hypertension, diabetes, and high cholesterol and coronary artery disease, people are getting well and they're feeling good. And we want people to feel good about themselves. We want to help people to change their relationship with food. Because, just giving somebody a book and say, eat this, yeah, sure, we know we should eat some of these good things, but, how do you pull it off? And just like everything else, starting something new, whether it's going to run a marathon or lose 100 pounds, it's largely between the ears. There's some physical aspect of it, but it's largely just becoming more mindful and understanding your relationship and what drives you. because we know anybody can do anything that they put their minds to, and they can do anything that they want to do. It's finding out perhaps why you're not ready to make the change. But we'd love to help you make the change. We'd love to help you work through all that. Again, we want to be supportive and be the kind of practice that people, we know their name and they know our names. And so, lastly, welcome Caleb. Can't wait till you get home. And thanks for all the well wishes from all of you. And we'll be talking to you next week. Thanks for listening.